So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this session on new frontiers in systems analysis, theories, methods, and tools. My name is Fabian Wagner. I'm a senior research scholar at IIASA, and I'm also the dean of the Capacity Development Program or unit at IIASA. What has become clear over the last, this morning and already yesterday, and to anybody who opens the newspapers, that we are facing huge challenges: climate change, biodiversity loss, managing risks, inequity, you name it. We all know that action is needed, but as Elena pointed out this morning, we need to address the how-to question, how to address these challenges. And one of the tasks that we have set us here in this session is to think about the question of methods and how to integrate humans and institutions into our analysis of the challenges. So the big questions here really are: what are the mechanisms to bring about change? And how do we even start to understand such mechanisms? In this session, we bring together 6 distinguished speakers to address these questions. We start out with, we think, 2 presentations that will address more the formal methods to understand people's behavior. And then we're going to continue with 4 presentations about approaches to actually incorporate actual people into our research. Our first speaker is Martin Nowak. Martin, I hope you're here. Martin is a professor for mathematics and biology at Harvard University. He is joining us via Zoom. And I give the floor to Martin Nowak now. We can't hear you, Martin. Maybe you're muted?
I'm not muted.
Ah, there you are. Yes.
Excellent.
Very good. We can hear you. Thank you.
Excellent.
You've got 20 minutes.
Excellent.
15 minutes.
15 minutes, that's good. So I'm very happy to be in Vienna. I love to be in Vienna, and I take every opportunity to go there. I say that I'm also very happy that I can participate in this IIASA meeting. I was a young scientist at IIASA in 1989, and this was a very crucial moment at the beginning of my career. So it's very much for me a coming home. Let me share my screen. Can you see this? I hope you can see this. Let me know if there's a problem. So the title of my talk is Toward Global Cooperation. I have been studying cooperation for the last 20 years, and cooperation is a phenomenon in biology that has been there from the very beginning of life. As we can see in this image, cyanobacteria that existed some 3 billion years ago have already cooperated in the sense that every so often a cell dies to feed the others with nitrogen. Or 125 million years ago, here ants, workers do not reproduce themselves, but they help another individual, the queen, reproduce. And of course, cooperation plays a very important role in organization of human society. And here's the famous painting by Vincent van Gogh of the Good Samaritan. But I think we are, as Fabian said, at a very crucial point right now, because all of this somehow is not enough to solve our problems. And we need more than this, and we need what I call global cooperation, and we need cooperation with future generations. So what is cooperation? Cooperation is an interaction where there's a donor, and the donor pays a cost, and the recipient gets a benefit. Do you see my slides? I hope so.
We do.
The prisoner's dilemma is a game that describes the interaction between cooperation and defection. And so if 2 players play this game of cooperation or donation, and if you cooperate and I cooperate, then your payoff is B minus C, because you pay the cost for your cooperation, but you get the benefit of my cooperation. So your payoff here is B minus C if you choose to cooperate and if I cooperate. But if you defect, your payoff is B if I cooperate. If you cooperate and I defect, your payoff is minus C. And if I defect and you defect, your payoff is 0. So this is the payoff matrix, and based on this payoff matrix, you should make a choice whether to cooperate or not. And one way to analyze this game is from an economic perspective, from a rational, so-called rational analysis in game theory or Nash equilibrium. And this would be, you could assume I cooperate. If I cooperate, then you have a choice between the payoff B minus C and the payoff B, and B is greater than B minus C. So under the assumption I cooperate, it's better for you to defect, because B is greater than B minus C. Let's suppose I defect, then again you have a choice between 0 and minus C, but if you defect, your payoff is better than if you cooperate, because 0 is greater than minus C. So if you assume I might defect, it's also better for you to defect. So no matter what you assume I might be doing, it's better for you to defect. And if I analyze the game in the same rational way, we end up with a 0 payoff, and now we are both unhappy, because had we cooperated, we both would have received a greater payoff B minus C, which is positive, because B is greater than C is greater than 0. So this is the dilemma. Rational players defect and end up with a low payoff 0, and irrational players might cooperate but receive a higher payoff B minus C. This is the analysis in terms of game theory, as was pioneered by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern, but you could also perform an analysis in the sense of evolutionary game theory, as was pioneered by John Maynard Smith and Carl Sigmund in Vienna and Josef Hofbauer. And in evolutionary game theory, you do not argue in terms of rationality. You just say there are individuals, like cells, for example, who either cooperate or defect. And in any mixed population, very simple consideration will show you that defectors always have a higher payoff than cooperators. And the assumption in evolutionary game theory is that that which has a higher payoff reproduces faster. So after some time, there are more defectors, and in the end, there are only defectors. So a very interesting example here where natural selection destroys what is good for the population. We go from a population that is almost all cooperators with a few defectors to a population where we are only left with defectors. And natural selection here works against what would be ideal for the population. So this underlines, again, the problem of how to get evolution of cooperation to work. So natural selection needs help to favor cooperators over defectors. And this help can be given in so-called mechanisms, what I call mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation. And there are many thousands of papers on this question, how natural selection could see the advantage of cooperation. And I classified in 2006 those papers into so-called 5 mechanisms. And these mechanisms are direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, spatial selection, group selection, and kin selection. And for humans, some of the most powerful mechanisms are actually direct reciprocity and indirect reciprocity. And I will focus on direct reciprocity and indirect reciprocity in this presentation. So direct reciprocity is the idea, I help you and you help me. There is a repeated prisoner's dilemma in direct reciprocity. So instead of playing the game once, we play it several times. And if we play the game several times, then the rational analysis or the evolutionary analysis demonstrate that defection is not the only option. You can actually get cooperation if you repeat the game. So if you play the game again and again with the same person, cooperation becomes an option. The question is, how is cooperation achieved? And the question is, what is a useful strategy for playing this game? And the first strategy that was described as being kind of the solution for how to play the repeated prisoner's dilemma is tit for tat. And tit for tat is a very simple strategy, and it says, I start with cooperation, and if you cooperate, I will cooperate, and if you defect, I will defect. And this strategy was submitted by Anatol Rapoport to the famous computer tournaments that were performed by Robert Axelrod. So tit for tat is a very simple strategy. It does not try to defect first, but it does whatever you do in the last round. The problem with tit for tat is if 2 tit for tat players meet each other and there is a mistake in terms of a fuzzy mind or trembling hand, then tit for tat cannot correct mistakes. So tit for tat has a very low payoff in a real-world simulation where mistakes are possible. In my PhD thesis with Carl Sigmund, I proposed an improvement of this and a resolution of this problem, and this is generous tit for tat. And generous tit for tat starts with cooperation. And if you cooperate, I will cooperate. And if you defect, I will cooperate with a certain probability. And this is the winning strategy under natural selection. It is preferred over tit for tat in a world where mistakes are possible. But it also shows that a natural selection can actually lead to forgiveness. So forgiveness is a concept in evolutionary game theory. Winning strategies have to know how to forgive. This is very important. And later we described another strategy, which is called win, stay, lose, shift. And this is if I'm doing well, then I repeat my payoff. And if I'm doing badly, I change my move. And if you really work out the details of the strategy on a paper, you realize it can also correct mistakes. But it has also an advantage over generous tit for tat in that it is not neutral with unconditional cooperation. So for those who know the repeated prisoner's dilemma well, these two strategies, win, stay, lose, shift, and generous tit for tat, are greatly favored over tit for tat, in fact. But the other mechanism that we have to consider whenever we talk about humans is indirect reciprocity. And indirect reciprocity is the idea that I help you and somebody will help me. And again, the Good Samaritan here, whatever his motivation was for helping this person, it was presumably not the idea this is the first round of a repeated prisoner's dilemma. It was more the idea, if I would be in such a situation, I wish somebody would help me. So how could we get indirect reciprocity to work? And Carl Sigmund and I analyzed this in 1998, and we proposed that indirect reciprocity can work via reputation. So you pay a cost for the recipient to get a benefit, and then your reputation increases. Or you defect, and then your reputation goes down. So the experimental confirmation came a few years later by Klaus Wedekind and Manfred Milinski. People help those who help others, and helpful people have a higher payoff in the end. The games of indirect reciprocity use social intelligence and human language because you have to understand who interacts with whom and for what reason. And that, I think, is really the selection pressure that led to social intelligence in humans. But also you have to be able to talk to each other about others. And that is the right scenario that would select for emergence of human language. As my friend David Haig at Harvard put it, for direct reciprocity, you need a face, and for indirect reciprocity, you need a name. For direct reciprocity, you need to remember people, but for indirect reciprocity, you need a mechanism to talk to each other about others. So evolution of human language. And only very recently, together with Laura Schmidt at ISD Austria, we actually discovered a very successful strategy that seems to solve all problems that we had been analyzing of indirect reciprocity for the last 10 or 20 years, and this is generous scoring. And generous scoring is the strategy that you always cooperate with someone who has a good reputation, but you sometimes cooperate with someone who has a bad reputation. And again, this is something that leads to cooperation and can correct mistakes that arise in a society by attributing incorrect reputation to people. One question that is of interest here is, can indirect reciprocity stabilize global cooperation? Can we go from pairwise interactions to actually interactions in a larger world? And this was analyzed. So the idea here would be that there's a population of individuals and they play the game of indirect reciprocity with each other, but they also can choose to cooperate with the global environment or to defect with the global environment. And this is a game, a paper that was done together with Oliver Hauser in 2016. And it was an experimental study where we have a large public goods game. And in that large public goods game, people can either cooperate or they can defect with the global environment. And if they do this, then in the control condition, afterwards, they play a pairwise game, but they do not know what people have done in the global game. But in the treatment condition, they also play a pairwise game, but they know what people have contributed with whom they interact in the pairwise game. So in the treatment condition, you know what your neighbor has done with respect to environmental efficiency. And in the control condition, you have no clue. You just play a pairwise game. You know what the neighbor has done to you last time. And what we find here is that there's a big difference between treatment and control. So the public good contribution stays high over many rounds in the treatment scenario. That means if you link environmentally good behavior to local interactions with your friends, you can actually keep it. You can keep cooperation in a very large group in the sense of the public goods game, which is the problem of global cooperation. So the suggestion here is by linking global cooperation to local interactions, this is one way to solve the problem. But I think we are confronted with another and even more complicated problem, and this is what I call cooperation is the future. And this was analyzed in a paper that was published in Nature in 2014. And here it is also an experimental setup that we first did with students at Harvard Business School. So you have a common resource, and you have 5 people around that common resource, and each person can choose to extract, to exploit this common resource by taking between 0 and 20 points. So if all people take 20 points, the resource goes down to 0. And then we tell people, but note after you, other people want to play the game, and we call this the next generation. So after you have made your decision, there will be 5 other people coming into the room, and they will play the game, and they will have to continue to play with what you have left in the pot for them. And the game works like this. If you leave at least 50 units in the pot, we will replenish the resource to 100, and they can start anew. If you extract more than 50 in the pot, the resource is exhausted, and other people cannot play the game at all. Other people are just sent home. So they get 0 payoff in that game. So when we are telling the subjects, there are 100 units in the pool, what is your choice? And we remind them, after you, there are so many other groups of 5 people. So these are the future generations that are being lined up, and they want to play the game, provided there's something left in the pot for them. How much do you want to extract? And the surprising observation is that 80% of pools were completely destroyed in the first round. This was done with students of Harvard Business School at first, but later we replicated these experiments more broadly and found very similar behavior. 80% of pools were destroyed in the first round, and all pools were destroyed in 3 rounds. So absolutely no concern for people who come to play the game after them. And a typical outcome is that there are many people who actually take what would be environmentally conscious, so that they take either 10 or slightly less, but a few people who take the maximum, and therefore they bring the pot down and the game is destroyed. And when we interviewed such people afterwards, they said they realized that this is how the game works, and they did not want to be exploited. They did not want to lose out. And what we then did to solve the game, I'm almost done. What we then did to solve the game was really, we say, let's do it now with media and voting. So let's harness the power of democracy. And voting means that each person can vote how much should be taken out, and that is then given to everybody. And this actually allowed all pools to sustain indefinitely. And this is described as a caring majority can secure the future. But an intermediate treatment of partial voting does not work, so we call this the Kyoto Protocol. If 3 people have like a binding vote and 2 other people, Canada and US, can do whatever they want, then everything gets destroyed. And I just end here with this particular slide. This is really the history of life on Earth for the last 4.5 billion years. Impressive with all the things that came and went. But we are in this tiny, tiny moment we are right now. And the question is really, for how long? Because for the stability of intelligent life, we need global cooperation, and we need cooperation with the future. I think intelligent life is inherently unstable. And unless we solve these problems, our lifetime on that timescale will be very short. And I should also mention that I'm very excited about the Science and Art project at YASA that was going for many years. And here you see Gloria Benedict and Carl Sigmund at the presentation. And this is really a very important project to make the public aware of the acuteness of the situation and to promote scientific results in the mind of the public. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin, for this excellent and inspiring presentation. I think we have still time for a few questions. Are there any in the room? Are there any online questions? I can't see. We have one question here at the front.
Hello, Martin. Gustav Feuchtinger.
Hello.
My question is the following. I know you and Karl are specialists in evolutionary game theory. We discussed this also a couple of times with the Nobel Prize winner, you know him very well, Reinhard Selten. And we are working at IIASA and also a small group at the Technical University on differential games. Which is quite different. Could you comment, please? For instance, Reinhard Selten is against differential games for various reasons, and he is specialist also in evolutionary games. But we are working in these differential games. Could you comment briefly? What is your opinion on that field?
I don't know if I have a particular opinion. I think that every approach is useful that can be justified, and I wouldn't rule out this approach. What we tried recently was actually stochastic games, and in so-called stochastic games we link different prisoners' dilemmas that also has to do with environmental deterioration, and we show that this could also be effective to augment cooperation far beyond what is normally possible. So if people understand that their public good extraction destroys the environment, then they could actually be incentivized to cooperate far beyond what would you expect without a feedback from the environment.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? There's one up there.
Hi, Martin. This is Elion from IIASA. Thank you very much for your talk. One question I have is this game of global cooperation. One issue is the size of the system, so the fact that we are so many interconnected. So you touch upon a bit this topic when you have this connection between the micro and the micro game and macro cooperation. So I wonder if there are other general results that you can share, and also the topic of different worldviews that is also a challenge in our global need for global cooperation. So whether you have some also general insights on those topics.
So that's a very good question, and we have in that one paper, in the 2016 paper, we actually performed an experiment with up to 1,000 people at the same time. This was the largest online experiment that we could, that was as ever performed in that area. So it worked for up to 1,000 people. Of course, that's still small compared to a real global scale. But the hope would be that this mechanism is something that actually scales up. So you carry with you a reputation about environmental concern, and this is a reputation that helps you in pairwise interactions. And the other question, what was the other question?
Was about worldviews and different paradigms.
Oh yes, so I'm also trying approaches where people are interacting in a game, but their worldview makes them interpret the payoff very differently. This is something new that we are trying. So some people may only play for economic gains, and other people play the same game, but actually have other payoffs in mind. And I find that very interesting. But that's a very new approach for us.
Thank you very much, Martin. In the interest of time, we need to move on. Thanks for joining us in this session, and greetings back to Harvard. Before we move on to the next speaker, I would like to just remind you that this session was organized mainly by Elena Rovenskaya and a little bit by myself, so thank you very much, Elena, for bringing us all together in this room at this time. Our next speaker is Alexander Lebedev. He works at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and he will be talking about social moods and its implications for research and policy making. Alexander, the floor is yours for 15 minutes.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Alexander. Today I'm going to be talking about the global societal dynamics and its implications on the way we live, the way we make decisions. Just wanted to say that I have background in psychiatry. I'm a psychiatrist and data scientist. Today, I'm going to cover these topics, and at the same time, due to time constraints, I cannot tell you my own story of how I ended up working in the field of global societal dynamics and complexity science, but just know that Austria has a very special place in my heart for many reasons. At the same time, I recognize that for some of you, I may seem like a complete outsider. And in my defense, I want to say that I'm not the first psychiatrist to dive into this topic. I don't know how many of you, will recognize who this gentleman is. Turns out that back in the days, there was another psychiatrist who was very interested in these matters. He came to Vienna in 1907 to meet a very influential Austrian, whom he later managed to piss off quite substantially. I'm referring to Carl Jung and his interactions with Sigmund Freud. Of course, Jung's work has nothing to do with data science. He relied on methods which are very hard to sell to the audience of complexity scientists, but to me at least, he is a very influential figure and frankly an inspiration when it comes to studying global societal dynamics. In my opinion, many of his ideas are yet to be revisited by modern science, including one on the most misunderstood concept of the collective unconscious, which he coined. He was the first to talk about psyche emerging from the group, the collective psyche, the collective experience. And another famous quote by him is about Hitler, who he studied a lot. He is the unconscious of 78 million Germans. He said, implying that certain ideas require fertile socioeconomic soil to spread in the society. Of course, we didn't have socioeconomics in its present form during those days. This field was developed by other two giants on whose shoulders we're standing. An economist, Robert Prechter, and a mathematician and a complexity scientist, John Casti, who I had an honor and privilege to meet in Vienna after our first socioeconomic paper got published. In their work, social mood is defined as shared mental state among humans that arises from social interactions. There are other related terms that some other authors use that you can meet in the literature. So I already mentioned Jungian collective unconscious. Interestingly, Hegel talked about very similar construct that depending on the scale, he would frame as Zeitgeist, a Volkgeist, or Weltgeist. Some authors see parallels with Adam Smith's Invisible Hand of the Market. But today I'm going to be talking about measurable aspects of this phenomenon. Here I'm referencing a book by John, which has been very influential for my work. And I recommend Mood Matters to anyone interested in the field of socioeconomics. Here you see some peculiar observations from the book on the links between fashion and cultural trends with economic and demographic indicators, which can be metric sticks for the social mood. This is not a direct quote from the book. Rather, I wanted to define the concept as precisely as I possibly could to make sure that we can have productive discussions about it. There are many areas of socioeconomics. Just to name a few, I must say that actually it is very easy to talk about social mood with people working in sales, especially those who are highly experienced in their business. They recognize the importance of tracking societal and cultural trends and that have direct implications and impact on people, on what people are buying and selling. Worse in politics and another explosive area of conversations, why certain ideas land in certain times and even if they seem bizarre and highly inhumane. Same goes to science and research. There are some sad stories to tell from my own country of origin, and of course, policy making, and the cultural trends. And of course, what we want to understand is how all these facets of the social mood go together and influence each other. As a scientist, I recognize that unless one comes up with an acceptable measure for the topic, it's very hard to have valuable discussions on the matter, which can easily slip into hand-waving and conversations about metaphysics, which are, I believe, outside the scope of today's event. Fortunately, we have some good metric sticks for an inherently hidden construct of the social mood. Thus, for example, it has been shown that the stock market dynamics exhibit strong associations with people's well-being and related well-being related behavior, including self-harm and suicide rates, which themselves can be useful indicators depending on the study outcomes, and a number of fatal car accidents. There are other useful indicators, like, for example, housing prices, which has been linked to fluctuations of stress-related metrics, like, for example, blood pressure, even in people who do not actively monitor the state of the economy, which is actually the majority of the population. Well, the employment rate is another example of these kinds of metrics. There is another component to that equation. Well, there are studies showing that a single global event can impact brains on, well, of even those without the first-hand experience of such events. For example, it was shown that geographic proximity to 9/11 terrorist attack area is related to amygdala reactivation during memory recollection task, and amygdala is one of the key regions involved in emotional processing and processing fear. Finally, there are studies showing that some changes in policymaking, for example, imposing restrictions, have a direct impact on morphological characteristics of people's brain. And in our study, we really wanted to put these two observations together and investigate how sort of more subtle day-to-day, month-to-month fluctuations in the economic state of a society is related to the key brain circuits known to be important for emotional processing. In this study published this year, we looked into the data from a large population of the UK citizens collected over 14 years. We were quite lucky with the studied period during which the market was in a number of different states, and importantly, a subsample of the subjects also had their brain scans collected over the period of 5.5 years. We pre-registered the study prior to receiving the data and picked the following metrics of interest. It was FTSE 100, which is the capital market index for the UK. We later amended the protocol to look at other metrics like unemployment rates and housing prices, replicating the results. As for the brain data, we picked the regions that are well known to be important for emotional processing, like cingulate region, subgenual cingulate area, lateral orbitofrontal cortex, and amygdala, and of course, nucleus accumbens. First, we replicated previous observations showing that well-being related metrics strongly related to the state of the economy. This effect survived very rigorous adjustment for a wide variety of confounds and their combinations, which I'm happy to talk about during Q&A. But then some reviewers argued, well, with the sample that big, you can find associations between anything, even though we couldn't really agree with the argument. Considering the discovered magnitude of the effect sizes, we decided to play along, and we're fortunate enough to find another study during which a single individual tracked his own well-being and well-being related behavior patterns over the course of 1.5 years, and also scanned his brain twice a week. So we replicated our findings in a single subject study conducted in a completely different country for a different period. Finally, we embarked on addressing our main hypothesis on the link between global societal dynamics and the brain, and confirmed this link for emotional neural circuits. Interestingly, for the lateral orbitofrontal cortex, a region involved in processing stress and expectations, we found an interesting interaction effect with the income. Specifically, we showed that the brains of financial minorities, people with very high and very low income, are the most affected, are the ones most affected by the state transitions in the society. We also did the analysis in different time beams, showing that the strongest effects are seen during the state transition events. Our main effects were seen at different scales in the raw data, day, month averaged observations. We also replicated the effects in another medium sample study from the United States, completely different population with different recruitment incentives, but also in that single subject study that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, that study did not have the structural data. We had to use functional measures as a proxy, but overall, we replicated the exact same effect, showing that they generalize over different samples, time periods, and biological metrics. Then we decided to explore the specificity of our findings by replacing the UK capital market with other capital market indexes from the UK top 15 top trading partners. We sorted them according to the economic distance, in this case, based on market-market correlation. But we also replicated this by looking at the percentage of all exports as another metric. We found that the markets that are most distant from the UK exhibit weaker association with the investigated biological metrics. Then we also looked into temporal distance. As expected, we identified that brain volumes correlate higher with earlier market data, and the opposite was seen for the later market data, providing some insights into potential causal links. It is worth noting that we also have done proper analysis of temporal causality, which I'm happy to talk about during Q&A if you're interested. Also, I want to say that the results were replicated with other candidate metrics. We also used unemployment rates and housing prices as alternatives. And finally, what you have seen so far pertains to the linear relationship, right, which is a strong assumption. And I have to say that these results were also replicated leveraging nonlinear methods. Well, those of you who are particularly curious, we used mutual information criterion to address this. Then we decided to look into the effects of cultural distance on the studied associations. For that, we used a completely independent study by Liu that came up with a very elegant strategy to quantify cultural distances between the countries by analyzing the amount of cultural exchange, such as, for example, travels of the artists, genre preferences, and some other metrics. And again, we replicated previous observations by showing that the markets of culturally more distant countries exhibit weaker associations with the brain data of the UK citizens. Well, finally, I want to spend the remaining time talking about a different area of socioeconomic research, or the implications of socioeconomic research, which pertains to the reproducibility of studies involving human subjects and the outcomes that may have, well, direct corresponding with the societal well-being. One good example is the research on efficacy of antidepressants for treating depression and placebo effects in particular. Highly debated topic in psychiatry, I must say. Some authors identified relationship between baseline severity of depression and treatment response, claiming that, well, there is a very limited population of severely depressed individuals who benefit from active treatments, whereas for depressive episodes of mild and moderate severity, well, the difference is either non-significant or not clinically relevant compared to the active treatment with respect to difference relative to placebo. So there are also observations suggesting that placebo response is increasing over the years. There are a few suggested explanations for this. Maybe the overall quality of the studies is increasing. We also learn to take better care of the patients who are involved in the study and so on. But we also had some other thoughts in mind. We wanted to investigate to what extent placebo response in depression treatment is dependent on socioeconomic context. So we pre-registered the study on Open Science Foundation to look at the number of metrics. So we used OECD data on suicide rates collected over different countries. And we matched this information by date with the outcomes of clinical trials from this large, well, probably the largest meta-analysis on comparative efficacy of antidepressants. And our main outcomes were a proportion of responders and remitters. That's usually what the researchers care about. Well, as expected, we found strong impact of these metrics on the outcomes. For example, we showed that during the periods of the socioeconomic, negativity, let me call it this way, as indexed by higher suicide rates, the proportion of responders and remitters was lower. The opposite effect was seen for the dropouts. So for more sort of turbulent times, there were more dropouts in general. These effects were seen in both active and placebo groups, but the effects were much larger in the placebo group, and these interaction effects were significant. So here again, these are the results of the linear methods, but we replicated that with the nonlinear methods as well. So we fitted the minimal model, kind of addressing the main effect, group effect, and the interaction, but also the adjusted model where we addressed also the effects of time and the total number of subjects. Then we limited the study by a subsample of trials conducted in North America and matched it with the American suicide rates, replicating the effects. The interaction effects were even larger. And then we did, again, the same cultural matching, and again, showing that the distance actually exhibit both strong impact on the main outcomes of the study. So more distant countries, suicide rates from more distant countries have weaker effects. The same goes to the temporal distance. So if you shift the time for approximate correspondence when the study was conducted, so these effects are substantially stronger here. More negative means stronger effects because it's a negative impact on the study outcomes. So, well, to conclusions, we managed to show that socioeconomic state of the society strongly impacts people's mood, well-being, and affective circuits, as well as placebo response in psychiatric research. We can observe this at different scales from an individual to global societal levels. We can index social mood by a number of large-scale metrics, including stock market and suicide rates. And for the first one, I also mentioned that we used other metrics. Actually, in the second study, we also used homicide rates as an alternative metric, replicating the results as well. The identified effects are related to economic, cultural, and temporal distances, and we can further quantify these effects. And finally, the minorities appear to be particularly sensitive to the aforementioned effects. Yet there are still a few open questions that we want to investigate. That's the matter of our future research. Well, one interesting question, how global is this impact in the face of reproducibility crisis in biomedical sciences, and especially in the sciences involving human subject and sociological research? What are the protective factors, given our observations on the minorities being most affected with respect to friends network, cultural diversity, sense of belonging and inclusion, individual and group resilience, if we're talking about survivability and resilience of the companies? Well, finally, what's the impact of the policy making and global decisions? I didn't talk at all about our other studies around pandemics. So, for example, we identified very sensitive population to the informational campaigns around pandemic who are more prone to developing conspiracy ideation when the restriction policy are imposed. So these matters have direct implications on the policy making, that is for sure. And well, finally, it is very interesting to investigate how specific socioeconomic sentiments impact efficacy of certain treatments. So my own area of psychopharmacological research entails working with medical application of psychedelics, a very hyped theme of research right now, which bothers me quite a bit. And well, one particular research inquiry is to what extent sort of the social sentiment around certain treatments impact the outcomes of clinical trials. So right now, the studies are reporting very large effect sizes, and well, our hunch is that it is really related to how the treatments are recognized in the society. I think that was all I wanted to talk about today. There were some key things that I omitted. I'm happy to address them during the discussion. Wanted to remind you that what I was talking about is not only my own work, so it's a result of the group work. So I'm forever thankful for these people who are involved in the research at different stages. And, you know, again, I wanted to remind you that, well, most of the data that I present is publicly open. And I started with a quote by Carl Jung, and I wanted to end it this way: to ask the right question is already half of the solution of a problem quite frequently. Thank you very much for your attention. Happy to move on to the Q&A.
Thank you, Alexander. This is a plate full. We have a question here in the room by Gustav.
Thank you very much for this rich and future-oriented talk. I think this is really research topics of the future. I have a small remark and a question. The remark concerns John Casti, who was member at my university, Vienna University of Technology, and we had the opportunity to discuss these issues in a nutshell several years ago. And I would also draw your attention to this Professor Liljenström from Stockholm, who also presented some emotions with a fast velocity compared with the rational decision-making in a much smaller context. And my question is simply the following. You presented us a lot of figures and diagrams describing here the development of social mood. And my question simply is, could you summarize this in an ordinary differential equation describing the accumulation and the decumulation of this state variable social mood?
Thank you. Thank you for the generous words. Well, I wish I could describe accurately the behavior of the social mood and the emergence of the social mood with an equation. I do not have this capacity right now. You know, at the same time, we have done some simulations. Actually, I will show you very quickly what we have done. We've done some simulations when addressing some of the criticisms that we were receiving when working on the paper. Well, just let me start by saying that there is a number of pitfalls when it comes to the analysis of the time series with fractal properties. And well, as we know, fractal properties are usually present in many naturally occurring systems in nature. For example, the thunderstorms, sea waves, and in a way, stock market and some other metrics characterizing social moods, they exhibit scale-free properties. So we did the simulation, well, first rejecting the fact that these associations could be discovered by chance with a uniform noise. But if you model it as a colored noise, so noise, and actually colored noise is the kind of noise that's present in nature, right? Sea waves, windstorm. Well, even for the fun of it, we converted well the sounds of the stock market, and well, I will not bore you with the details. So if we have a minute, I can show you how it sounds. It sounds actually very similar to the windstorm and sea waves, showing that it exhibits very similar properties to the naturally occurring systems in nature. Well, I don't have a capacity to describe it right now in a similar rigorous way. How, for example, earthquakes were modeled. That's another characteristics of a scale-free behavioral and naturally occurring system. But well, hopefully in the future we'll be able to do that. We're also partnering with Gustavo Deco, who is a mathematician. And well, that is definitely a future step to actually put it into equations and to see whether we are able to model it and match it with the experimental data.
Thank you. I think we are running out of time. Brian, maybe we can take this offline. You know how to contact Alexander. So there's more questions, Alexander, there's more interest, but I think in our interest of time, or in the interest of time, we're going to move on. Thanks very much for joining us. I hope there's more opportunity to talk to you at IIASA about these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Gerald Midgley from University of Hull. He's a professor for systems thinking in the Center for Systems Studies. And we're looking forward to your talk. We've got 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Wish you a happy birthday. So, what I want to talk with you about is integrating systems science and systems thinking to tackle complex socio-ecological problems, and I'm going to cover these. So I'm going to discuss the two wings of the systems movement. We heard a bit about this earlier today because you have a systems science movement and you have a systems thinking movement, and there's only a little bit of overlap between them, some people working across those boundaries. And I want to ask the question, does that actually matter? What happens if we try to fly with one wing? Well, I'm going to argue that for complex socio-ecological problems, it really does matter. We need to actually bring both together. And that there may be many situations in which systems thinking alone can be useful, but not these global problems. I'm going to give you a case study example of overcoming a 30-year conflict between environmental and economic values around water management in New Zealand. So I worked for 7 years in a government research institute in New Zealand and got involved in that. And I'll leave you with two methodological lessons for addressing complex socio-ecological problems. The little diagram there with the different colored ropes kind of indicates what I mean by integrating the two spheres. So let's start with one of the oldest elephants in the room. So this deep paradigm divide between systems science and systems thinking. It's been called many different things over the years, so these different labels have been used that are on the slide. I think the last three are particularly pernicious. So systems theory versus systems practice, as if you can have practice that doesn't embody theoretical assumptions. It's a strange split. Hard systems versus soft systems. So those terms were coined in the early 1980s. soft systems as a good thing and hard systems as a term of abuse, and then people labelled as hard systems thinkers tried to reverse it and called soft systems a term of abuse. It's really not helpful to label things like that. And perhaps the worst of all, the US tradition versus the UK tradition, which just makes the rest of the world's contributions invisible. So I want to move beyond those kinds of typifications. So I'm going to concentrate on some key strengths and weaknesses of systems science and systems thinking. Now, I've written a book and numerous papers looking at the critiques of these different things. So all I can say in 2 minutes of this talk is just focus on one strength and one weakness of each. And they will be significant generalizations. So I'm sure you can all think of particular systems scientists and systems thinkers who don't fall into this kind of generalization. But as a generalization, I think it holds, as a lot of the talks this morning illustrated. So systems science certainly brings theoretical insights and modeling capabilities and can reveal the systemic nature of socio-ecological problems. That's its great strength. But its significant weakness is suffering this tragedy of enlightenment, that we can have an answer, but can't always get buy-in from key decision makers. And the reason is that the more reliant the process is on expert modeling, the more difficult it becomes to make decision makers feel ownership of the findings. And it actually makes buy-in from a wide range of stakeholders even more difficult. You might have a really good relationship with one or two decision makers, but when you need to work with a wide range, it becomes very difficult if you're highly dependent on expert modeling. But there's corresponding and opposite strengths and weaknesses of systems thinking. So we offer methodologies for facilitated modeling, so it's mostly qualitative modeling, in the context of dialogue between decision makers and stakeholders. So I run numerous workshops bringing people together, and people do the modeling themselves. They're not reliant on the expert. It's a facilitation mode instead of an expert modeler mode. So buy-in is easier and implementation is much more likely. But they mostly neglect to work with theories of ecological and economic systems. So you're dependent on whatever expertise happens to be in the room. And if there's a groupthink that excludes any serious knowledge of ecological systems, then you can have a serious problem. So if those are the generalizations we can make, I want to describe a case study of where we brought the two things together and how it worked in practice. The project I'm going to talk about should really be credited to Brian Jenkins. Brian Jenkins was the Chief Executive of Environment Canterbury in New Zealand, and he really saw through the leadership of this whole program. I got involved in some consultancy right in the middle of it, and although he would say that my input into it was pivotal in the process, I would also say it would have had no impact without his overall management of the system. So here's the context. We're talking about a period from 2008 to about 2015. Agriculture, horticulture and forestry in Canterbury accounted for over 40% of New Zealand's exports, so it was hugely important, that region, to New Zealand. And water was seriously over-allocated. There were highly water-dependent industries. Dairy was growing rapidly because it was the most profitable area of farming. And there were conflicts between economic and environmental values. So for 25 years, the elected representatives in the council were completely split, with rural stakeholders supporting the economic arguments and urban councillors supporting the environmental ones. And they were dependent really on the leaders' vote to stop the split. But it was a paralysed decision-making environment. it was so tense that I went to meetings where people would literally just stand and shout at each other. It was that entrenched, and people wouldn't go to meetings to have reasonable discussions with other people. So the environmental regulation was collapsing because landowners were taking the council to court in order to get more water. The council's legal bill was running at $3 million a month, which means they were having to divert resources from actual environmental regulation to fund the legal bills against this kind of revolution from farmers. And so something basically had to be done. Brian Jenkins was appointed chief executive to try to resolve this problem. And this was his overall methodological approach. So he started with deep exploration of the complexities of the context. He explored the ecological issues, conflict and marginalization in the processes. He took 18 months to do that, and I must say I heard stakeholders saying, when's some action going to be taken? 18 months is a long time, but he really had to get to know the stakeholders. He hired a consultancy company to use an approach called open strategy, and he took out a consultation into every single town and village in Canterbury and gathered value statements about water. And that's the point at which Brian came to me, because he said, well, we've done this participative exercise, but it's generated 40,000 value statements about water. What the hell do I do with that kind of complexity? And so I talked with him, through with him some options that we could work with. The first thing we did is abstract out of that 10 major decision areas that people had to deal with, which includes things like irrigation, do you take more water, water quality, preservation of native ecosystems, climate change. There were 10 areas in total. And I asked him, does he have a group of stakeholder leaders who you can trust will take their own stances but be open-minded to listening to others, and will actually work with their own constituencies and not just stay in a room, reach an agreement, and then it fails when you go out there? And he said, yes, he's got a group of 20 people who can do that. So we worked with him and those 20 stakeholders across 3 days to look at what alternative strategies could be that would deal with these 10 decision areas, working across these 10 decision areas, using an approach called strategic choice, which I'll tell you a little bit more about now. So this is the core idea of strategic choice. Brian had already consulted on the full range of values. We condensed them into those key value statements. And then what you do is you identify those decision areas. As I say, there were 10 of them. Within each one, you look at the possible policy options that you might have. So it might look something like that. And then the key thing you do next is not just to look for compatibilities across these policy options, but also incompatibilities. So you can't, for example, take more water for irrigation and improve water quality at the same time unless you can get more water from somewhere else. And after having gone through this exercise, they came up with 3 feasible strategies. The first strategy was to put the economy first and to say, let's forget about the environmental values. We just dam the rivers and we take as much water as the farmers say they need for irrigation. The second strategy was environment first. We put a complete moratorium on further water takes, and we preserve the environment. The third strategy is not a balance between those two. I'd stress that it's not a balance between those two. The third strategy was innovation in water use. So it was looking at things like new technology for efficient water use. It was changing the governance processes around water, and it was taking water from the Alps where there are snow caps. And I want to tell you a little bit about that last strategy because it's the one that the community bought into. So we went out into the community and consulted with in extensive public meetings, and it was a completely transformed atmosphere. People still disagreed, but people were disagreeing much more reasonably, and there was a convergence on this third strategy, which hadn't been possible for 25 years. Now, going to go to the bottom point there. The implementation plan really drew upon system science ideas, and I want to explain that. So the governance restructuring was based on Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning approach to governance of the commons. All the governance boundaries were redrawn to coincide with catchments. There was multi-stakeholder involvement, so each catchment board had different interests represented on it. The council changed its role from regulation to information provision, and they said they would only invoke regulation if these catchment boards failed. Stakeholders were required to manage all 10 decision areas simultaneously. So there was no saying, okay, we'll do the economy now for the next 5 years and then we'll go back to environmental values. They always, for every solution to one problem, they had to think about what they were going to do in the other 9 areas to keep all 10 areas moving simultaneously. And the 10 decision areas had 10 indicator sets associated with them. And the design of those indicator sets was also based on systems theory. So it was based on Gunderson and Holling's panarchy theory. And the idea was that because ecosystems cycle, and you can see similar cycles also in economic systems, it means the best way to provide information for the governance boards is not for them to set targets and then see if they meet them, but to set the upper and lower constraints of viability to keep the ecosystem cycling within constraints that would be beneficial for managing all 10 of those decision areas. And so you set upper and lower constraints and looked at how close different variables were coming to violating those constraints. Now, I did a follow-up 5 years later to see how successful that had been, because I left New Zealand in 2010. I came back in 2015. And I think one of the really interesting things I discovered at that point, not only was it working well, the whole thing was actually fully implemented and working in practice, but the national government had tried to bring the whole thing down because national government wanted us to take the economic strategy and abandon that third way. And so they went in and they abolished the elected authority and put in a quango, or a committee of 12 government appointees who are going to manage the water system. So bear in mind, these are people who supported the government's perspective on things. It only took them 2 weeks talking to the stakeholders to realize that they couldn't manage the system in the way that the government wanted them to. And they did a complete about-face and supported the kind of governance system that we talked about. So let me leave you with just 2 lessons for tackling complex ecological problems. The first is that we need both changes to minds or stakeholder understandings, and that was achieved by widespread community engagement and the strategic choice approach that I just described. So that was basically informed by systems thinking. But we also need changes in structure, changes in to minds and structures need to go hand in hand. So the changes to the governance structures were informed by systems science. And if you try to change minds without changing structures, people just get frustrated because they can't enact their new insights. But if you try to change structures without changing minds, those structures get perverted into the pursuit of the old problematic ideas. So in both cases, the older system will reassert itself. You have to work at both scales simultaneously. So both changing structures and changing minds are necessary. And if changing minds is founded on systems thinking and changes structures requires information from systems science, both are absolutely necessary for success. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Just stay up here. Thanks. This was again extremely clear, and I like this this notion of complementarity of approaches, which may be a very deep lesson. Are there any questions from the floor? Anyone? Yeah, please, Nikita. There is a microphone coming.
Thank you very much for this interesting and clear talk. I have only one question, which we already discussed from a practical point of view. How did you implement such a large-scale project, which had a practical impact?
Well, I would say, how did Brian Jenkins implement it? Because the bit I was involved in was deciding on the strategic choice approach, and then the team that I worked with helped facilitate that. Brian Jenkins was the chief executive of a council, so they had scientific resources at their disposal. They had the income to invest in that community engagement. That community engagement really shifted things to start with, so that people were willing to actually hear the voices of the leaders that were in the group of 20. The conflict had been entrenched for so long that everybody wanted a way through it. I mean, it was just not viable, the current situation. So people, when they saw that it was possible to make a difference, went for it. And one of the big things that I think kept the environmentalists on board was that the water saving. They saved something like 80% of the water used for irrigation. So in the strategic plan, there was provision for building a dam, and it actually wasn't necessary because they managed to save that amount of water. And I think when I did the follow-up, only one environmental group had actually opted out of the governance, and that was because on the issue that they were concerned about, there were 60-year time lags in the progress of pollutants through rocks into water, and they couldn't see the benefits within their own lifetimes, basically. And that made them so frustrated they kind of withdrew. But that was the only drawback to the working of it.
Thank you. Elena? Can we have the second mic?
Yeah, now it should work. Yeah, thank you, Gerald, for this talk. And 40,000 value statements, I think, sound very impressive and looks like a right thing to do, actually, to me. I want to ask you about your last slide. Changes to minds are necessary, and changes to socio-ecological structures are necessary. Who should be the agents of this change? Who would trigger, who would start the change?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I was just writing about that before I came here to this conference, because you have to obviously start with minds, because it's changing people's minds that then those people can start to change the structures. That is the case, but the danger is neglecting to actually look at those more institutional factors by starting with minds. Now, when you say who, that depends on the context. So I've done projects with local government, with NGOs. I'm doing projects at the moment with national government, and it's different in each different context. I like to do an exploration, a boundary exploration, before I start any project, to actually look at who the stakeholders are and what the conflict and marginalization relationships are between them, so you know if you can bring them all into the same room or not, or whether you have to work with them separately. That's critical. Somebody this morning was talking about stakeholder analysis, and I'm working on a new method at the moment that actually looks at three things. It looks at the stakeholders that are currently engaged or should be engaged. stakeholders who would be engaged if you got your way to transform the system, because there's a bias in stakeholder analysis to the status quo. And the third thing is stakeholders who represent those aspects of the system that haven't got a voice. And if you cover those three things, you can have quite a reasonable representation in the room. Sometimes you're confronted with a situation where the decisions on who's involved are made for you because it's a government who's made those decisions. And then you have to work with questions about how do you represent other perspectives. And I've developed various techniques for doing that, for having multiple facilitators with different roles to represent different perspectives on this kind of thing.
Thank you, Gerald. I'm afraid we're running out of time. Thanks very much. And our next speaker is our own Elena Bruchin, rising superstar at IIASA, and she will be talking about bridging climate mitigation scenarios and insights from other disciplines.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really an amazing room. And my background is in political science, so obviously I will argue that insights from political science will solve all our problems. The insights that I will present today are coming from work where we try to bridge climate mitigation scenarios and insights from other disciplines. And we have already quite a few articles kind of going in this direction. And what I will try to do is to give you a broader kind of insight into where we are going and what is our approach, and then some more specific applications of our approach. So first of all, what are scenarios or pathways? So at IIASA, especially within the program where I'm in, we are using an integrated assessment model, MESSAGE, which covers main systems that could be sources or sinks of emissions. And here we connect energy, economy, and land systems. And one of the most interesting and main outputs from this model are the emission trajectories. And so also quite often, one of the key mechanisms to generate new scenarios is imposing carbon budget and from this learning how emission pathways could look like. In one of the most recent projects that we had, and that also then was quite a large share of scenarios that were included in the most recent IPCC reports. From the ENGAGE project, we had two types of scenarios, the so-called full century scenarios and net zero budget scenarios. And I'm showing here the results from the so-called 600 gigaton budget constraint. And then we see, so to stay within the 600 gigaton budget, which more or less corresponds to 1.5 degree goal, we need, right, to reach net zero somewhere between 2050 and 2070, sort of depending on the scenario that we are looking at. And in the net zero budget scenario, which relies much less on the so-called negative emissions than the peak scenarios, we need to reach it earlier. So we have really not too much time to transform the energy system and yeah, actually other systems. And just to show you the scale of transformation with slightly larger budget, with 1,000 gigaton budget, which roughly corresponds to 2 degrees, you can see that we really need to transform many sectors very rapidly, especially the electricity sector, where I think we can phase out coal, or need to phase out coal relatively rapidly, and especially the scale of transformation in the region for the Asian region is quite large, because currently they have quite a large share of high carbon intensity fuels. Yeah. And what is basically the scenarios are also really gaining on political prominence. So for example, the insights from the 1.5 degree report, where many of these integrated assessment model scenarios were used, are really directly used by policymakers during negotiations and also now during COP meetings. So the exact calculations from those scenarios. This, however, also means that these scenarios are scrutinized much more, and they're also getting much more criticism. So for example, during the recent also approval of the IPCC report, the credibility of these scenarios was questioned, or they were criticized for not taking into account equity issues, right, and sort of different capacity issues. And so the question is now, okay, how can political science contribute to address some of the concerns and some of the issues? And so we argued that political science can contribute to kind of two different lines. So first of all, we can systematically try to understand which assumptions in existing scenarios should be and could be improved. So this is the focus of my analysis. But at the same time, of course, political scientists also study a lot how certain issues get politicized, why they get politicized, how framing is important. So I think here we can also then learn a lot from political scientists, kind of how to present the scenarios so that politicians do not use them actually as tools in their discussions to delay mitigation or to question their credibility. So what we're trying to develop is to have a more systematic, iterative approach to bridge insights from scenarios with other disciplines. And so and it's really an iteration. So we have now a set of existing scenarios which we can benchmark to other lines of evidence, learn from this, and then as a next step, try to think, okay, how can we develop new scenario narratives, and then start again. And through this, hopefully improve our knowledge and find kind of the gaps that we currently have in the existing scenarios. So I'm focusing now on what we can learn from benchmarking scenarios to other lines of evidence. So we tried to evaluate scenarios from the feasibility perspective. And everyone also understands different things under feasibility, but we defined it as a degree to which scenarios lie within the boundaries of societal capacities in a given time period. And this temporal dimension is also important and adds complexity, but I think we know that, of course, the level of uncertainty also increases as we get towards the end of the century. And the core kind of this approach is to evaluate scenarios from the feasibility perspective or from other perspective is basically to use kind of the outputs from scenarios that we have, so the trajectories from scenarios, and benchmark those to other lines of evidence. And again, important to keep in mind that process integrate assessment models, right, gives us, again, scenarios that are part of the system, right? So it's not enough just to look maybe at one variable, at one indicator, but we really need to have a sort of multidimensional approach to understand what is going on in the scenarios. And this is basically what we did. So relying on past work from the 1.5 degree IPCC report, we said we can maybe systematically try to understand what is going on in scenarios and benchmark this to other lines of evidence. If we look at the geophysical dimension, so basically the geophysical boundaries, do some scenarios assume maybe too high levels of biomass, which other scholars think are unsustainable or are not reasonable. Then from the economic perspective, again, what are the assumptions about the costs? Globally, can we assume that this is reasonable or not? Then the technological one, here we mostly look at the scale-ups of the different types of technologies, so the new technologies, also established technologies. From the social cultural perspective, of course, scenarios also assume certain lifestyle changes, so changes in the overall demand patterns, so that we could also think about, okay, how reasonable are some of the scales of changes that we have. And finally, of course, the institutional, this is where political science kind of brings in the most. So basically, we were also checking, we know that institutional capacity, so the capacity to implement policy really differs across countries, and this plays a bigger role, for example, also in environmental protection, so there's quite enough empirical evidence related to that, and therefore it's reasonable to assume that it also plays a role in implementing policies that relate to climate mitigation. So there we were also benchmarking basically institutional capacity that we have in certain regions with the scale of mitigation that is assumed in scenarios. So, and again, the major point that we are making with this approach and many indicators is that we need these multiple dimensions because a scenario is essentially a system. And what did we learn from this? So we evaluated also the scenarios that were included in the recent AR6 report. And one of the major insights was that actually quite a lot of mitigation is assumed in regions which have very low this institutional capacity. And there again, to the institutional capacity, we measured through government effectiveness, so this ability to implement policies. But this is to a certain degree not surprising, because if you again go back to the key driving assumptions of for example, message, because the optimal solution that is found minimizes the total discounted system costs, right? Therefore, the mitigation happens in the regions where it's the cheapest. So it's actually not the goal also of the current models to incorporate this institutional dimension. So therefore, while we argued that we think that the feasibility of future mitigation might strongly depend on the deployment, on the developments of future institutional capacity, this needs to be somehow addressed in the next generation of scenarios so that we also take these institutional risks better into account. And therefore, the next question, the next kind of part in this approach is, okay, how do we actually develop new scenario narratives, and how do we integrate social science and this integrate assessment modeling world? And that's very challenging. And again, here we thought we will start with something simple. And our goal is not really to develop a new model that would reflect all the complexities of political decision making, but rather to develop a new scenario space that would reflect better the different risks that come from different political futures. And here we also recently published a paper where we summarize some ideas, and our proposal is basically to think kind of how to relate the two worlds, the world of integrated assessment models with empirical models, right? And empirical models can be quantitative models or qualitative models, but basically the patterns that we know from various political studies or social science studies that somehow help us understand, for example, how variation in institutional capacity explains variation in policy output, so policy implementation, but also policy outcomes. So in terms of what are the effects actually of the policies. And what we are trying to do is to try to find the overlaps also in the variables that we have in the empirical models and the variables that we have in integrated assessment models, and try to think, okay, how can we adjust some of the assumptions in the integrated assessment models so that we reflect the patterns from empirical models a little bit better. And for example, at the moment, our focus is really trying to explore this institutional capacity, incorporate this, changing the assumptions in the message model, and through this develop new scenarios that incorporate the institutional risks. So just to summarize the points, so a lot can be learned, I think, by systematically benchmarking scenarios to other lines of evidence. And again, we were interested in the feasibility concept, but there is now a lot of discussion about justice, equity, and it really, it's actually can be used for many different concepts. It's just important to have a clear operationalization of the concept, and then I think we can think how to systematically link it to scenario data. And then the second point is that, again, at the moment, what we are trying to do is not to have this representation of all political complexities, but rather to enhance the existing scenario space with new scenarios that take political futures and political risks a little bit better into account. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Just stay here. Yeah. Are there any questions from the floor? Yeah? Elena?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Elena. Very promising, I think, this novelties and this incorporation of these new constraints and new variables. I'm just curious more on the details of this, how to measure this capacity concretely. Like, do you already at that stage, or are you already at that stage to sort of tell us what exactly are those indicators that can measure it empirically?
So we started experimenting with World Bank indicators of the government effectiveness, because for those we also now have projections along the SSP trajectories. So there we also kind of use econometric tools. So first there was work by Marina Andrejević, who has shown that we can use GDP per capita, a level of education, and gender equality as the predictors for governance capacity. And then she projected those along the SSPs, which is very useful in scenario context, because then we know that, for example, this generation of scenarios is along SSP2, and we can see, okay, what are the governance trajectories along SSP2, and then kind of see what is the assumed level of mitigation for different regions compared to their governance level. But we are experimenting with different things. We actually now also have a big group of political scientists who's interested in this, and there are, of course, different types of measurements. We will also experiment a little bit more with democracy measure, more political regime measures, and see what we get out of this. And again, the way we integrate this in the model at the moment is by then constraining the regional emissions, basically how fast they can decline. But I think we can also explore much more complex implementation, where we will also learn by sector, because we know that institutions might matter also differently depending on the technology or the sector we are looking into. But this will be obviously much more complex. So at the moment, we're looking for a simple experiment to see kind of where it would get us. Yeah.
Thank you. Can we have the second microphone for yeah? Could you switch on the second microphone for Gerald? Yeah, just.
Is it on?
Yeah.
I don't. It is now. Okay. I was just thinking that I had a PhD student who came to me after a lifetime's work in scenario consulting. He'd done about 40, 50 years' work in that field, and he came to do a PhD because he kept having the same problem. He said within certain mental constraints, scenarios would open people's horizons to different possible futures. But he said there was always one horizon, always one scenario, rather, that they would just not accept. They would say, it's not feasible that happens. And he said, time and again, that's the scenario that actually unfolded and still caught them by surprise. And I wonder if you've any reflections on that, of how you really get people to open their minds to different possible futures.
Yeah, I guess it's a very difficult question, but I think it's helpful maybe to slightly enhance the type of scenarios that we are showing, and I think this then helps also to develop better arguments. For example, if a policymaker comes and says, well, this is not feasible, right, that we can show the alternatives and say, well, if your goal is 1.5 degrees and there is a global agreement on that, these are the range of options that we have. We can also have a scenario, for example, where developed countries do much more, but we just don't have so much wiggle room, right? And we can show this to them and say, well, if you're serious about 1.5 degrees, what we can do is to show you all the range of options, right? And see, but it's up to policymakers in the end then to implement what they consider to be feasible.
There's one question.
I have a similar question, which is basically said, but I don't understand. How do you define political futures?
Yeah. So I thought political futures is more, also different types of narratives that we can explore. So there are these shared socioeconomic pathways that I mentioned, the SSPs. And I think they already give some narratives, right? That the SSP1, a sort of more positive world, and SSP2 is the continuation of the current trends. But I think with political futures, what we can explore more is a bit different assumptions about the institutional developments across the regions. But I think, of course, where political science and the subfield of international relations also interested in is conflicts, right? And what we can see at the moment also that the geopolitical futures sort of matter a lot on which trajectory we are. And again, here political science can help to develop different types of narratives and scenario and to help policymakers to understand, okay, where could we develop if we have more regional conflicts in the world and we have like a disruption of cooperation, right? So I think this is the point, to enrich the current kind of set of narratives with insights from political science. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Elina. Again, we're running out of time. Thanks for your questions. We're moving on, and our next speaker is Eva Vilkuma. She's an assistant professor at Aalto University in Finland. I hope, Eva, you're here, and you have 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, I hope everybody can see the slides now. So good evening, everyone. My name is Eva Vilkuma, and I am indeed an assistant professor of management science at Aalto University School of Business. So I will be continuing to talk about scenarios, echoing the previous presentation. So I'm hoping maybe my presentation might give Elina some ideas of how to incorporate different kinds of aspects and views into the scenarios. So, as we've heard, so many important policy decisions are made under very high levels of uncertainty. So future outcomes of different decision alternatives may really depend on complex interdependencies between, for instance, technological and socioeconomic and political and ecological developments. So these complex interdependencies result in multiple possible, plausible trajectories for the future. So from the perspective of making good decisions, it doesn't make sense to try to forecast how the future will unfold, but rather it is better to try and capture the range of uncertainties through developing multiple scenarios for that future. So ideally, these scenarios should be plausible in that they're kind of internally coherent or credible narratives about the future, but also they should be sufficiently dissimilar so that they're not just variations of the same theme, but really represent different kinds of futures. And in many contexts, it's not sufficient to just use quantitative data to generate these scenarios, but rather sometimes you need to use things or data not about events that have occurred in the past, but rather about things that have never taken place before. And this thinking of the unthinkable or the unprecedented can be very crucial when preparing for alternative futures, especially in long-term strategic making. So in these kinds of cases, it really pays off to utilize expert judgment alongside, if not instead of, quantitative data. Because as humans, we have the capability to really envision something new, come up with ideas of things that have never occurred before. So today I will be presenting a method that we have developed for supporting the identification of a small but diverse set of scenarios that can be used to support this kind of long-term strategic decision making. And the purpose of this method is to combine this human capability for creative thinking and thinking of the unprecedented with the capabilities of methods of operations research and systems analysis to manage the complexity resulting from the inclusion of various sources of uncertainty in the analysis. So I'll present the method by using a real case that we did together with the Finnish National Emergency Supply Organization. So this is an organization in Finland which is responsible for maintaining Finnish strategic reserves and preparedness. And this was joint work with my very talented doctoral student, Teemu Seeve, whose picture is right there. This actually took place in 2017, and then the NESO was interested in developing scenarios as a part of their sort of general foresight efforts. And this process began with identifying what is called key uncertainty factors affecting Finland's operational environment. And ultimately 10 uncertainty factors represented by these blue dots here in the figure were chosen as the most uncertain and impactful ones to be included in the analysis. So for each of these 10 uncertainty factors, the experts came up with 4 alternative outcomes each. So for instance, here we have the uncertainty factor related to globalization and international relations. So it was seen that these relations and globalization could either be A, slow and steady globalization, or B, fast and market-driven globalization, C, blocks and new alliances, or D, protectionism and deglobalization. And you had similarly 4 different types of outcomes for geopolitical focus, state of security, foreign affairs of Finland, natural resources and migrations, data accessibility and information security, global economy, development of the EU, intelligent systems and machines, and industrial structure and work. So scenarios could then be built based on combinations of these different kinds of outcomes on different uncertainty factors. And here we have illustrated one combination by these blue cells. So the question is, which combinations should be used as a basis for developing these scenarios? So here, some problems arise related to combinatorial explosion. So the number of different kinds of combinations increases exponentially as a function of the number of uncertainty factors. Here we had 10 uncertainty factors with 4 outcomes each. So we have 4 to the power of 10, so over 1 million different combinations to choose from. And if we go a little bit further along, so if we want to choose a set of 4 combinations, then there are so many ways to do this that I would even try to find a word for the magnitude of this number, but that depended on whether you're a Finn or an English speaker, so I decided not to say it. So a lot of combinations, nevertheless. So this problem of combinatorial explosion is sometimes solved by grouping these uncertainty factors together and then ultimately choosing sort of the 2 or 3 most important groups of uncertainty factors and then kind of building the scenarios on top of those. However, this kind of limits the comprehensiveness of the developed scenarios and maybe prohibits the full inclusion of the diversity of views that can be held by experts, for instance, from different fields representing political views or important concerns related to justice alongside climate things, for instance. Okay, so we propose that analytical methods can be used to efficiently identify a good set of scenarios, even when the number of uncertainty factors is relatively large, so 10 or even 15. So this method that we have developed helps find a set of scenarios that are plausible in that they are internally consistent and also dissimilar in that they together cover all of these outcomes for different uncertainty factors that initially were seen as possible or plausible developments for these different uncertainties. So how to assess plausibility? In our method, scenario plausibility is assessed by using consistency analysis. So in this consistency analysis, experts make judgments about the consistency of pairs of outcomes on different uncertainty factors using a scale from -3 to 3. So -3 means that these outcomes are not likely to occur simultaneously, and 3 means that they induce one another, so they are likely to take place at the same time. And the overall consistency of a combination of outcomes is just computed as the average of pairwise consistencies. So here we have, for instance, if uncertainty factor has an outcome B, uncertainty factor has an outcome D, and uncertainty factor 3 has an outcome B, then we just pick those consistency values from the table and compute the average as 2. So in this way, the tasks of assessing scenario plausibilities are divided into smaller subtasks, which are cognitively less demanding. And then this analytical method of taking an average is used to aggregate, again, this information into scenario consistencies. And this work, although it might seem tedious, is also a way to kind of challenge the participants' mental models in that they're really forced to think about which things could happen together and simultaneously in the same scenario, which might then also, related to the question for the previous presentation, might kind of make them more responsive to then even surprising combinations that end up being a part of the scenario set. So, efficient algorithms we have developed to compute these overall consistencies based on pairwise assessments, and these consistency values can be used to filter out inconsistent combinations from further analysis. So the next task was to choose out of these consistent combinations those that would be diverse, so sufficiently dissimilar from one another. And we did this by formulating a weighted set cover problem, which is here. So we have a decision variable X saying that, okay, do I choose this one combination out of n consistent combinations? And we have a constraint here, which ensures that each outcome is included in at least one of those chosen combinations so that all outcomes are covered. And then we have an objective function vector. This C bar is the consistency value vector, and this objective function vector is defined such that fewer combinations are preferred to more. So we don't want a bunch of scenarios, but a small amount. And then the consistency of the least consistent combination is maximized. So we want to kind of not have very inconsistent scenarios taken as a part of the final set. And more details are given in the article, so I won't go too deeply into those. So just a brief illustration of the impact of the objective function. Here we have two feasible combinations, sets of combinations of these 10 uncertainty factors. The consistency values are in the bottom rows. So in the top one, the most consistent combination has a higher consistency than for the bottom one, but the least consistent combination looks better in terms of consistency in the bottom one. So that's what we prefer. So the combinations are, of course, not the end of the story, but rather after we have then used this analytical method to choose the combinations, it's time for the human insight and input to come to play again. So a narrative development is what happens based on these combinations. So here are just two combinations that were in the set of the final set of combinations, the blue one and the orange one, and just a few lines from the start of the scenario narratives. So here, for instance, scenario 1 was called global interdependency. So you had kind of West being the stable haven and international institutions being strengthened. Whereas scenario 2, called Armed Power Politics, was about climate conditions deteriorating and escalated armed conflicts in, for instance, eastern Ukraine. So different kinds of scenarios that might now raise some thoughts. So these were made in 2017, and they have some echoes to the world in which we live today. Altogether, 5 scenarios were developed for this case. And those two can be found with the full narratives in the paper. But basically, that concludes my talk. I was trying to be quick to get us back on time. So scenarios often need to be based on expert judgments. So you want to have diverse inputs about what the key uncertainty factors are, what the developments for these factors are, and what the consistencies between them are. But analytical methods can really help take all this information into account and maybe create stories, narratives that people would not have thought about before. And we've since really applied these methods in different kinds of contexts, including hydroenergy, mobility, media, renewable materials, and so on and so forth. So it's a generic method and really has nice application areas. Okay, but that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening. If there are any questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Eva. This was exceedingly clear. Are there any questions from the floor? Yes, Nikita.
Thank you, Eva. It's really interesting and really close to also what we are doing with scenarios. So I have one question about the expert judgment on consistency. So of course it's a much larger number of combinations than initially, but still, how do you kind of motivate the experts to fill it in a sensible way? Because from our perspective, if there are so many combinations, sometimes we answer just randomly. We put all zeros or all minus, like what did you do to improve the results? And the second question was, you limited the number of narratives to 5. So what is actually, how do you select a threshold? How many optimal combinations should one choose? 2, 3, 5, or even 10? Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Nikita, for that question. First, about the consistency analysis, yes, it can be tedious. So we usually don't have one person filling out the entire table, or we never have that. So we kind of ask people, like, what's your area of expertise? So which parts of the table would you like to fill out? And then it's always done in a facilitated mode. So not leaving someone to fill them out by themselves, but rather it's an interview process. So then they're able to ask sort of, what does this concept actually mean? How am I supposed to interpret this? So that's how we control for the sort of fatigue that can take place and then might result in bad numbers. And then about the number of narratives. So basically we have, since 2017, actually, we've created this optimization formulation, and that results in the smallest possible number of scenarios. So in the case that I showed you, the smallest number is 4, because you have 4 outcomes for each uncertainty factor, and you need to cover all of them. And the smallest amount of combinations that you can do that with is 4. But in that case, it was actually done with this visual software tool that we also, Teemu actually developed that by himself. And that's why they kind of chose it a bit differently, a bit more in an ad hoc manner, and ended up with 5. But the optimal formulation sort of is the maximal number of outcomes for any of the uncertainty factors. That's the smallest possible number you can get. Thanks. Hope that answers your questions.
Yeah, seems like, yeah, thank you.
Good.
What I could hear was that there's kind of a theme going on in this session about thinking outside the box, the necessity, and you apparently found a very structured way to think outside the box and to force people to think outside the box. Is that a fair assessment?
It is, and what we really wanted to do is kind of combine the benefits of the human capabilities of thinking outside the box and analytical capabilities of managing complexity. And I think out of the combination of the two, you get something like which is more than the sum of its parts, because the combinations can be really surprising, even though the input does come from experts. So that has been very nice to notice in each of our application cases.
But you don't force the experts to think outside the box, right? you force them to think inside the box somehow. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but sometimes it's good to get like the goodness of the scenarios obviously depends on the goodness of the uncertainty table. So it's good to get a broad range of views, and if you can think about those outside of the box, it's always better.
Thanks. And we have time for one more question, if there is one. And if not, then thank you very much again, Eva, for joining us today. And we're looking forward to hopefully seeing you at IIASA in person soon. We move on. Thank you. We move on to our last but not least speaker for today, Valeria Javalera Rincon. And she's also one of our homegrown superstars. And she will talk about integrating models, stakeholders, and technology from a bottom-up sustainable development perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for the introduction, and thank you also for the invitation. Well, today I would like to talk to you about our experience on system analysis innovation and how we as a team at IIASA, together with an international consortium, integrate models, stakeholders, and technology from bottom-up sustainable development on the integrated and land use food system space. We have been talking about a lot of these days about the system analysis evolution, and after 50 years of IIASA experience, all these reflections on system analysis, we realize that the world is evolving and there are enormous challenges in front of us. I'm doing an analogy between what we study in computer systems when we talk about the different paradigms that have been in programming. And we separate all these evolutions in paradigms. And there have been a lot of changes in paradigms in computer science when it reflects to programming. And I think we are also in system analysis in a change, in the middle of a change of a paradigm. And I think many people will think the same. So it's not just a system analysis evolution, but you could also say it's a system analysis revolution. And two of the main factors that what I think, or why I call it this way, two of the main changes that have triggered these advances. From one side, it's international agreements and collaboration networks. We have more consolidated institutions and organizations, and we have the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. From there, we start on already agreement and cooperation between the countries who have signed the agreement. So also technological advances like communication technology, digitalization, data availability, data science, remote sensing, satellite images, etc. So these two are the main, or are the grounds of the fabled projects. I think the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, and the use of the different technologies in communication and many capacities in technology have helped us to innovate on system analysis. So the Food, Agriculture, Biodiversity, Land Use, and Energy Consortium, FABLE. Our vision is collective science-based action driving the pressing global challenges each of our countries is faced with. We believe that global collaboration between nations can be used to address global goals by recognizing each country's autonomy, capacity, responsibility, and contribution. We create a collaborative space to support and challenge each other in support of evidence-based decision-making. So in this consortium, we have country teams, and country teams are the heart of Fable mission. Country teams develop their own national pathways for a sustainable food and land use system that describe the changes needed to achieve mid-century sustainability objectives. They also engage with national governments to promote ambitious sustainable policies. But all this effort on the country's side needs to be integrated at the global level, so it's everything consistent. For this, we have developed a methodology that we call the Senaton. It comes from Marathon of Scenarios, a word created by Michael Obsteiner. And this methodology has some of the features of this methodology. It's that it's a bottom-up methodology. It's distributed because each country has their own model and they handle by themselves. It's multi-layer because you have the country level layer and then you have the global layer also. It's multi-stakeholder because every country engage with the stakeholders at the country level. And it's also iterative. So it's important that this methodology is iterative because in this way you can really engage in a conversation considering the priorities at the national level, but also feedback at the global level. So very briefly, what we do in a Senaton is a virtual exercise. So we have it remotely. We have a web site where all this happens. Could be from 1 week to a few weeks. Before the Senaton, we first agree on the global targets. The global targets are achieving the SDGs, the Paris Climate Agreement, and ensuring the stability of the Earth system. From here, we choose our targets, and we take care of that every country level integrated model can report in the same term. So we have, for all the countries, this methodology is heterogeneously. Countries use different, use different integrated assessment models like GloBiome, MACPI, or the Fable calculator. At this point, many countries have already, some of the countries are mature enough to have their own integrated assessment tool, like Brazil. With GloBiome, they have their own national version of GloBiome, or India that has MACPI. And they receive feedback or support from these teams so that they can develop this. But at this point, every country involved in Fable, we have 20 countries, have their own Fable calculator also up and running. This helps us in many ways, but in any case, even when they didn't have this Fable calculator, they reported in the same terms that the rest of them. So we have a standardized input and output system, and so we can really aggregate these values. So at the national level, the country teams collect and harmonize socioeconomic and biophysical data, compute the evolution, key values, and land use and food system by mid-century using appropriate models that they choose. They make their national model, and then they submit to our website. And during our website, we have the linker tool who makes the aggregation of the country result. It also makes validation and quality analysis. And provide the global dashboard that brings to the country, the countries, the the result of their efforts, like what's the contribution, what's the advance to the global target globally, and what's also the contribution by country for every target. And also some general knowledge on common indicators. This also, when the first time a country makes a submission, there will always be inconsistencies, especially in trade. So when the country makes their plan, and from now to 2050, they will make assumptions on their market and their behavior. So we need to align these trade volumes so we keep the balance in the market. This is made on the linker tool as well, and we have been using different methods to do this. But this has to be adjusted and resubmitted by the countries after this adjustment. Countries engage with the stakeholders so they can review, critique, and provide input. And so also to be sure, more or less, that these promises or what they are submitting, it's realistic. Okay. Also, we are using machine learning applications on experimental cenatons. These are not yet made globally with the 20 countries, but we have this year we had a cenaton with some of the favored countries for specific products. We use machine learning to explore and learn from millions of scenario combinations, as just in the previous presentation, Eva was explaining how the combinations from the scenarios from each country are just it's exaggerated values. So we explored offline, and also we optimized trade using reinforcement learning, and to align and to optimize these trade values in a way in which all global targets, or especially the ones that are related to sustainability, are where the impact of the trade is minimized. Also, because the complexity or the combination of these scenarios it's too much even to do offline, and even when we used first information provided by the countries, we first ask, and then we start to do combinations around their first choice. The complexity is very high, so the team, Fernando and Marcial, have been making new research on identifying the system behavior and how this behavior impact the global targets. Some of the lessons learned in FABLE, in a few days it will be our 5th anniversary. It will be 5 years old. And in this time, one of the things that I think we have learned is an efficient method to reduce uncertainty. It's innate communication. We need to ask and listen from the countries what are their priorities, and what is we have learned to understand that we always have partial information, especially when we are talking about the global model. In this case, it's a distributed model, but in any case, we always work with partial information. So our system of reliefs is not the same. They have another vision, and at the end, they will be the ones who make the decision. So it's very important to engage in this communication, and so far it has worked, I think, well. So communication, when we want to improve communication, it also increases complexity because connectivity increases complexity, and so we need then methods to coordinate the communication. and to optimize that communication. So anyway, you will have complexity. You choose if you want to optimize your communication or you want to address the problem centralized in a very sophisticated, integrated model. So it has been very important to be a community of trust and collaboration, respect the autonomy, capacity of the teams, and also open science, transparency. And now automatization, it's also part of our process, so now we're capable of getting information from stakeholders and implement it directly in the country models using, in this case, only the Fable calculator. These are some of our latest publications, policy briefs, and you can know more about our results on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Valeria. Are there any questions from the floor? Jim.
So, Fable is a beautiful thing. And it's perfectly what EASA should be doing, in the sense it provides this global overarching framework and then draws upon the insights and policy objectives from particular places, particularly countries, and brings that to the table. However, where it potentially brings both power in policy circles is, as I think you were suggesting there, in identifying where there are incongruences between national policies and global goals, even when countries subscribe to those global goals. And I'm wondering whether you think the analysis is yet robust enough to really challenge national governments to expose these incongruences when you've identified them?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Well, first of all, what we suggest when after one iteration, for example, during the Senaton, the consistency, the first thing in consistency that we look for is on trade. So we look that trade is consistent, that there is a buyer for every seller, that the market is balanced for imports and exports. Otherwise, we are not accounting realistically. So this is the type of inconsistencies that we need. That first of all we have to look for in order to really then go to the analysis on what's the contribution from each country to these global targets. And here, what we do in Fable is to present evidence. We do not promote certain policies or actions, but we present the evidence on the pathway that all these countries have submitted. This is the future. This is how it looks on emissions. This is how it looks in the forest cover change, et cetera, et cetera. And they have their own evidence created by themselves and how this looks for them. So after each iteration, they have the details of their national model and have their contribution also to the global model. Now, yes, it is complicated. We have been having some cases in which, of course, one country may change their pathway on, for example, their plans on exports, and maybe other countries are doing the same. So we need to then reduce the level of exports, and then we need to make an agreement on how to balance this trade. So this has been complicated. At the beginning, we did it proportionally, but now we're using machine learning to really present some choices to the countries that give us the idea on what's the best option for the global targets. They will decide if they take this option or not.
Again, I'm afraid that we are running out of time. You can hear it, you can probably smell it, that there is coffee downstairs. And also another session starting in 5 minutes here. I would like to thank Valeria again. I would like to thank all the speakers, online and offline and in person, that they have contributed. Thanks to Elena again for organizing the session. And thanks for all of you to have chosen this session rather than the parallel session. Enjoy the rest of the evening.